Adoption brings our worlds together. Adoption brings our worlds together. Come and share with me. Adoption brings our worlds together. Adoption brings our worlds together. Adoption brings our worlds together. Come and share with me. Share with me.
Welcome to the Journey to Josiah podcast. I'm your host, David Marshall, founder and CEO of Journey to Josiah Incorporated. I am excited to have as my guest Sequoyah Sherrill. Sequoyah is a clinically licensed and trained psychotherapist, author, breakthrough breathwork coach, and mental health advocate. Sequoyah received a Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology from Hampton University, a master's in couple and family therapy from Drexel University, and a certificate in women's entrepreneurship from Cornell University. She is clinically licensed as a marriage and family therapist in Maryland and DC. Sequoyah currently serves as co-founder and COO of Solid Ground Wellness, an outpatient mental health clinic serving Baltimore, Maryland, and surrounding areas. Additionally, she is also the founder and CEO of On My Couch, a wellness collective and consulting agency founded to dismantle the stigma surrounding mental health in the Black community. She has also written and self-published two children's books entitled Is That Your Mommy? And We Need You Too. Sequoyah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course. Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
Absolutely. So I tell everything. So I'm going to tell the audience this. So we done started on this for our third time. So we ready to have this conversation because technology ain't been blessing us this morning, and it's shut us down a couple times. But we done made it. We made it over, right?
We made it through. We got it.
I live for
We
these
here.
things.
We here.
Absolutely. Well, I invited Sequoyah, as you all have heard, based on her extensive and very impressive bio. She is a therapist. And I want to have the conversation around discussing the idea of adoption and fostering with our children. So many of us, as adoptive parents, we struggle with this kind of conversation. It's scary, and often we don't know where to start, how to begin, what that looks like, how we help our children in processing this whole thing. And so and because I'm an adoptive parent, and I make no lie, lots of these things are selfish on my part, but I also know that this is something that I'm not alone in. And so I want to start out by talking a bit about that. What you are a family, and you're a family therapist and a marriage therapist as well. Um, when you started, this is going to be a little personal before we go into kind of the nuts and bolts of the conversation. When you started out in this work, what was your vision for the work?
Ooh, that's a good one. That's a good one. When I started out in this work, I was honestly very, very enthusiastic. I had my Superwoman cape on, okay?
Hmm.
I wanted to save the Black community in totality, and I didn't know how big of a task that was.
Mm.
That is still my vision. It still holds true. But fast forward almost 15 years later, I know that I have to use my gifts where, where I have to work in my gifts. I can't save the entire community. So that is still very much so my goal, to help my community heal mentally, and how that looks holistically, not just in the space of just mental, but wellness, holistic wellness, just helping my community there, is where I am now. So yeah.
And and going back into your bio, and when you say your community, and I hear that because your work in surrounding tearing down the stigma of mental health in the Black community is such a necessary thing, because it is something that we before we got on here, again, I'm a tell it all kind of person. We were having that kind of conversation as it pertains to our community and Black men in particular. And so it is so necessary that we are tearing down that wall. And I think so much of it has to do with, especially us living in this social media age, and social media
Mm.
allows for many
Mhm.
facades, and we
Mhm.
like to project the image of perfection. There's a
Mhm.
different kind of pressure now, and so but when we live authentically, contrary in my opinion to popular belief, it lends itself to a more a better, you show up a little better, is how I'll put that.
Mhm.
That's just my
Mhm.
little humble opinion on that.
I agree. I agree. I think authenticity is necessary. And I think that in my work, if I don't show authentically, a lot of my clients can see through it.
Mm.
They can see through not having that authenticity, not wanting to be there, not caring. They can see straight, especially the children. When I work with the children, they could see, they could feel.
Yeah, and that's the perfect kind of segue into children, because children, they definitely have that sixth sense. We look at babies and you know how they decide who they going to, who they don't want to go
Mhm.
to, and
Mhm.
we've
Mhm.
always said, you know, they have a discernment like nobody. Um,
No one.
so in discussing children, children seniors, they're our most vulnerable among us. And
Mhm.
and in walking this path in terms of children, I first want to ask you, what is your general approach as it pertains to, because and well, before even I go there, what is the youngest child that you've worked with?
The youngest child I've worked with is probably about 5.
Really?
Yeah, it was really hard, but yeah, 5. They threw me in there when I was in grad school.
Okay. And you know, it's interesting you say that because um I've kind of almost been, in my opinion, this might be a little bit dramatic, shut out of the therapy world as it pertains to my son because he's 6. And I'm like, but he's so I mean, he's very articulate. And I know there are
Mhm.
different ways to approach it. So when you're approaching, when you're working with children in that age group, tell me a little bit about your approach.
My approach is very juvenile. My approach is very much so meeting them where they are, just as I do with adults, you know. I think that therapy sometimes for 5 and 6 and 7-year olds can be scary because we want them to sit there and talk to us for an hour. We want them to sit up and sit in a chair, and who is doing, you got to go back to when you were 5, when you were 6. Even if I'm now a therapist that's in her 30s, I have to go back to that time. So when I was working with 5 and 6 year olds, I was in khakis or jeans. Everything about my day was very meticulous for children, so that I knew that I could play with them, have a good time with them, you know, like to break down those walls. So with children 5 and 6, a lot of those first few sessions, because I do have to pull mom and dad out at times, you know, like sometimes that's mandated that I have time with just the child. You have to fill that time with stuff that they would ordinarily do. So it would be puzzles, there would be coloring books, there would be, can you draw me a picture of, you know, your house, your mommy, your daddy, your family, you know, you have to just dig a little deeper and be a little more creative. But yeah, I met the children where they were 5 and 6. So there was a lot of on the floor, there was a lot of draw this for me, there was a lot of tell me more about that. There's a tell me stories, things that were relevant to their development.
That makes sense. And so would it be your thoughts that it, that children that we can that children do benefit in that, in the therapeutic setting, is something that is very, what's the word I'm looking for, uh, that not useful, but well, I'm gonna say, because I can't, you might be able to fix the word, but do you feel when they're that young that is a very useful thing for them to be in that therapy setting?
I do. I think what it's doing, and you're absolutely right, it is useful. It's giving them a tool, right? You know,
Hmm.
like a lot of what we do in therapy is we're creating space and teaching and giving tools for, you know, because people can't be in therapy for forever, you know, and I wouldn't recommend a child be with me. I don't like having children with me for far too long, because then they become, it's just a different level of attachment. It just becomes counterproductive. And
Mhm.
so in those settings, even though they're very small and we think, oh, they don't remember and things, we're giving them tools, right? They're when they are drawing, and I'm asking them to tell me about their family, we're allowing them to use their own language, right? To describe their setting.
Mhm.
And I think so many times we give children language to use, and so many times, especially children who are in school settings and are around peers, and who we don't give them enough credit for, their level of understanding, their level of comprehension. And so I think when they're with me, opposed to a mom jumping in and answering for them, in this space, they're finally given that freedom, especially in like the Black and Latino community, where children are not allowed to talk in certain settings, right? I
Mhm.
grew up in a time where there was a time and a place for a child to talk, right?
Yes.
And in therapy, it kind of takes that paradox away. Is
Mhm.
this is your time and place to talk,
Mhm.
and so
Mhm.
it gives them that tool. It starts to create that habit. And it sometimes takes a little longer for children that young to really get to the space where they're like, I can tell you, Miss Sequoyah, what's happening without getting in trouble by mommy, right? So it takes a
Mhm.
little bit of time. It might take about 6 or 7 months. And the reason why we don't see that attachment with the therapist sometimes, especially in the more urban settings, and more settings where parents are, just don't have the time for therapy. If they haven't built that attachment with that therapist, if that relationship, but the relationship is the most important part, right? So
Yeah.
if they don't build that relationship, a lot of times that's why they say therapy for children that young doesn't work, because the parent hasn't been as diligent as they should have been. So the child hasn't built the relationship with the therapist. So of course the child is coming to therapy sitting silently. Of course, the child is having a hard time expressing themselves because they don't feel comfortable with this therapist. And so we have to get to a space where we do give children that are that young more credit for how their feelings. They might not be readily able to use the words that we use, but in creative and different ways, we can figure out how they're truly feeling about situations.
It makes me think, I taught, and it is that differentiation thing. Every child is
Hmm.
different, and how
Hmm.
we are going to communicate, how we are going to help them in acquiring knowledge is going to be different and with every child. So it does take that time. It's so necessary to kinda dig in to figure out, well, what is gonna be this one's method? I can tell you right now, if it were my child, you're gonna have to bring some trucks. If you don't have any
Hmm.
trucks, we're probably not gonna talk about anything. So it's so necessary to be able to find that out. So going further in, as I said, we really want to dig into this adoption foster care kind of conversation. What is the youngest child that you have worked with who was adopted or maybe currently in the foster care system?
The youngest I've worked with, who when he got, so I worked with when he originally came into the system, he was about 6.
Mm,
So I started working with him around 6. And he was, it was, he wasn't adopted until he was about 11.
okay.
So I
Okay.
worked with him that entire time. Um, in preparation, and I mean, I worked with him through multiple foster homes, and then we worked to, prepare him for adoption, because it was quite a process,
Yeah.
feeling like this was it. Like, is this fine? Is this where I'm staying?
Hmm.
So
Hmm. And when you have one that young, so he came in 6 actually, and my son is 6 presently. Um, how do you help them to navigate and understand what this is that is happening in their world?
well, it depends. So that's okay. Y'all gonna have to go with me on this one. So with that particular child, he had experienced a wealth of like trauma at
Mhm.
an array of, different levels. And so that's also a conversation. So I always say, let's take a step back, because we can't even get into the therapeutic relationship just yet, because he's having an issue with trust, right? And so there's like a half a step before you even are building the relationship sometimes with some children, where you're just really like trying to just get past the barrier of them even talking to you. So in the beginning with the 6-year-old, when I would go and see him, he would be shut down. Shut down. He had so many social workers, so many therapists, so many, he had, when I got him, he was 6, but he had been in the system for some time. So he had come to develop his own understanding about what therapists and who social workers, but we all seem the same. And so I worked for a long time. I want to say maybe like 6 or 7 months. I was just going to school, just reaffirming that I was going to be there, reaffirming that my word was that he could trust my word. So there was a half a step before we even got to a relationship building, which was just showing up. So, I mean, that's really big, is just showing up, right? For these children. That's the first step. So I started to show up. And the more and more I started to show up, the more I did what I said I would do, the more he became, open to meeting with me. And I would go and I would show up and he would only allow me to be there for maybe 15, 20 minutes. He would walk out the room and just walk out like I'm done.
Wow.
So I would bring him snacks, I would bring him toys, I would bring him different things that would, hopefully distract him and make him want to stay longer. And with this child, he understood like that means nothing to me. So what meant something to him was someone showing up and doing what it is that we said we were going to do, even at the age of 6. So that I had a half a step with him before I even got to the point of building, a trusting relationship. So once we got to a space where he understood that I was going to do what I said I was going to do and I was going to be there, we developed a trusting relationship, right? And so then that's when I really started to be able to have conversations with him. And so that's when we started to, and they were very minimal. He maybe told me his day was good. Maybe told me he liked to, yes, I like it wouldn't even be something, how do you like your new home? He might not even say, I like my new home. He might just say, I like it, or yes, and so we had to build and learn. So it took a long time. And I think that's the struggle with fostered children, is that they oftentimes have multiple workers, right? And so a lot of times they don't have the advocacy that they need, or the advocacy that is tailored to them, because there are multiple workers that have come and gone, right? And so these children are used to abandonment. This is their norm. And so they shut down. And so a lot of the times, if a child is fostered for too long, they'll just get to a point where they shut down. So I always, try to make sure that the teams stay in place through these processes, because they can take time. And I think that leads me to my next point, is just like really being honest and as open with them about the process as you can be, even though they're young, with respect to their development, but don't leave them in the dark either. If they are going to therapy, if they need to talk about something, if this is an adult in this child's life, social worker, birth mother, whoever their support system is, they need to be reinforcing these things as positive things that will contribute to their life, because we're reworking how some children, some of them, not all of them, reworking how they view this therapist or this advocate, so it just really depends on the child. But first and foremost, it's that building that trust.
That's a whole nother dynamic when you say that in terms of children and foster care, because there's been so much transition, and sometimes relatively quickly, so they just couldn't get any place and just breathe. So I
Or
can
unpack their suitcase. I mean, can't do anything.
So then what you're saying is, initially there's just that you said you really got to win their trust, because they're just like, you'll be gone next week, like the other one last week.
And some of them try to speed up that process. Like some of them really try to test. My particular child, who I stayed with for those 5 years, did the gamut. I mean, he did the gamut. I was getting calls regularly about him. He would go, I mean, the homes, I would stay. I mean, this child I worked diligently with, because I felt like he didn't feel like he could trust anyone, because people were coming and going. So for me, I was like, I'm going to work over the top hard to make sure that he has at least me as a stable. If nothing else, Miss Sequoyah will know she will be here. She's not going to be unrealistically here. So sometimes he would do things like, I don't know, wet the bed at 11 o'clock at night, in hopes that would cause his foster mom to call me that I would come and advocate on his behalf. But we got to a point where I told him, like, I'm work hours, you have to set boundaries as well, and so like they do all different types of things to get attention and all types of different things, sometimes to speed up the process of you getting them out of your house because they know it's coming, right? Or they think it's coming. Like this particular child I thought the house was great. He immediately had his own room, didn't have to put up with any other children. It was a lot of different dynamics that were different than his other situations. And because it just, I think, felt too good to be true to him, he tried to speed up the exit. He tried to do everything in the house he could to get out so he could get back to his norm, being around other boys, being bullied. That's what he knew, being bullied. It didn't feel right being somewhere where they were waiting to cook him breakfast and waiting to see what he wanted for lunch and sending him with, snacks and the things he wanted. He didn't know how to respond to it.
So the unfortunate reality of it is that in these situations, it sounds like because the norm was being in these settings that may not have been the most healthy settings, it's because it's what they knew that they just were like, let me just go right on back because I know this. I know what to expect maybe in this situation. It's more of a, yeah, I know what to expect maybe. Is that what it would
Yes,
be?
there will be no more disappointment. There will be no new disappointment. That disappointment, I know. This new disappointment, this disappointment attached to, attachment, attached to, wait, there's 3 people in this house that actually want to love, y'all want to love me, like they don't want, to experience what that's like. And if it's a child that my child, entered at 6, he had an older brother, so he had a lot of ties to how he could understand how his life was before, pictures, things like that. So it's like, okay, well, the woman that I love, my mom, my aunt, my grandmother, whoever, they left me. So now you're starting to feel like them. I don't want to feel that again. Let me go back to this disappointment that I recognize, which are with people that I don't care about, so it's a little different. So yeah, at every intersection where it looked like it was going to be a good situation, I had to literally talk to the foster parents about, okay, can you please just give this a little time? Because this is what this child is expecting not to be given is time. He thinks that as soon as he does this, this is going to land him on the outside because that's what he's used to. Could we just give this another 2 weeks? Could we give this 3 weeks? Could we give this a month? I guarantee it would get better. And so as we started to have more conversations around what his norm was and, what he was coming from. And so that's why, whether it was fostered or adoptive, whatever parents I was talking to, I just really encourage them to just be as gracious and be as patient as they could be, because like time is very important in a lot of these scenarios. Sometimes, the youngest I had was 6. So, the only reason why it was sometimes 6 is like they don't have the greatest memory. So you might have a great, blank palette that you can work with. However, with this particular 6-year-old, he had siblings, he had so many other things that were constant reminders of what the life could have been. And then his siblings would tell him things to reinforce things. So it just depends on the child, their scenario, their upbringing up until that point. And also, what they're privy to, what they can remember, what is still tangible. My 6-year-old would still have run-ins with his mother out in the community. He would be out and he would be with one particular time he's with his foster mother at a grocery store, and his mother was there, his birth mother was there, the same birth mother that missed multiple meetings, was there with 2 of his little sisters, 2 new little sisters, like that he had never met, and then from there it just was a spiral. And the foster mother was not aware, she didn't know, but at some point in the grocery store interaction, he was able to see her, see his sisters, not say anything, but know them, and recognize even that young, like, wait, that's my mom. Those are 2 kids, like stroller, and we didn't find out about that for a long time. Like, I think it took a few months before I got that out of him. I think I was like playing basketball with him or something, and he finally said it, but we didn't understand what had happened. And that quick, 5 minutes in a grocery store, because we don't know what birth mom looks like, because we don't know, certain factors. And it's no fault of the foster parent, the adoptive parent. Sometimes you just don't have access to that information, but something that quick could set a child back. And so just really being aware that it literally can be anything.
So then he is then being re-traumatized only in a different way, I
Yes,
guess.
he was. Yeah, he was. So when he seen his, so he had been aware. He knew. He didn't. He was only about 6 or 7, so he didn't know. But they told him in a roundabout way, the reason why you're not going back to your mom hasn't come to any meetings. And he knew he had visitation with her, and it just, And so at some point, it then was removed, and then we got to a point where we adoption was on the table. And this was the particular story that I told you, that the person that wanted to adopt him was a single gentleman. So he ended up
Yes.
being successfully adopted by that single gentleman, but that single gentleman adopted him and his brother. So, but that didn't come for
Wow.
5 years. It took a long time before he was able to really get that in place. And in the midst of that, he was in multiple foster homes, and they kept trying to, introduce. Initially, it was adoption, and then as mom started to, suggest or or talk about her interests, she would always segue her interests. Every time it would come to a point where it's like, it's time for us to have a meeting. She would attempt to she say that she was going to get back on track and do everything, and so it would be renegotiated. It wouldn't be adoption wouldn't be back on the table. They go back to foster care, and then we talk about reintegration and reconnecting. It just always happened that way. Like, she always found a way to always get back right in time. And then and so it became a place where we just had to advocate, like, listen, mom has been doing this for 3 or 4 years. I think it was 3 years. And then we finally were able to get, foster dad in. He had them in care for like a year and a half. We were able to advocate. So yeah, it took a long time, but we were able to finally get, them adopted. But I mean, it was long, it was daunting. And there was just so many intersections that were unexpected by birth mom. And so it's a struggle, because you just, as when I was a therapist and a social worker for the agency, you just never knew what you were going to get hit with. So
And so with all of this, you have children then really in limbo, knowing that they're in limbo. And so we have then created a further damaging, if you will, situation, because they 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 don't they don't really know where they're going to land.
it almost becomes like a triangulation. If you have, an adoptive parent or a foster parent in place who wants to adopt, and then you have a mother you know who kind of intersects and, talks about her interests, and then you have the child who's like, well, that's my mom. So they become triangulated, where it's like, that's my mom, but then this is my foster mom, and she loves me, she wants to adopt me, she wants to provide me with this, but then that's my mom, and those are my siblings. So it becomes like this triangulation, and now you put a child that's very young in a situation where they have, misplaced loyalties. Now, it's like, where do I who do I go, so it can get really hard.
And with that, I've kind of seen that in terms of friends of mine who are foster parents who are prayerfully going to adopt the children that have been in their homes for periods of time. How do you help a child navigate this triangle?
Ooh, I think that it depends on that third part of the triangle, right? So if
Mm,
it depends heavily on that third part of the triangle. So if you have a birth mother that is, you know in a sense, semi together, is grounded, understands, her role, understands what you're trying to do, or birth father understands, whatever parent understand, whoever wants to be in that space, occupy that triangle, because triangulation isn't always a bad thing, if it's balanced. But typically, children, depending on their age, are going to go with their birth parent, regardless of what the situation is. Birth parent could be no homeless. Birth parent could have 5 other children with them that they can't take care of them. So we have to really know what that relationship is with that birth parent. Because as that foster parent who's looking to adopt, you're the foundation.
mhm.
We have seen what this birth parent can do, right? And so it is a hard space to be in, because you want to be graceful and you want to be respectful of that birth parent.
Yes.
But if you've seen what damage can be done, by all means, do what you need to do to protect that child, right? Because at the end of the day, you are the one that has to dry those tears. And, and so if the parent is, in a healthy space, then try to integrate them. That could be a really good space, but if the parent is not in a healthy space, and depending on how old the child is, like really being careful about the words that we use and the conversations that we have around
Yeah.
birth parents,
Mm-hmm.
not wanting to, down them or minimize them, always reminding them that this is their birth parent. We love them, we respect them for, bringing them into this world, for ensuring they're here, they're healthy, they're whole, that you have access to them. You want to reiterate those things. If it's something that's not so great about that birth parent story, depending on where the child is, if you're a parent that gives it to them straight with no chaser and they're 13 and above, like at a certain developmental age where they can understand, give them what you need to give them, right? Because they do deserve to know. Because because you never know, especially in a scenario where it's just a question mark, right? The
Mm-hmm.
question marks are the scariest part, like for children who may have not known their birth parents or who may not recognize them out. But for children who are like 6 and above that you may have adopted or know, it can be a very sticky place. So, if you're in, if it, so, and there's just so many different types of adoptions. Children come from so many different places. So it really just depends on the scenario. But I would say the two top situations I generally see are either birth parent has it together, or is getting it together, getting their life together, is in a more stable place, is still not in a place to take care of the child, and is respecting of your role as their parent.
Mm-hmm.
You include them. You
Okay.
include them. You try to include them as best as you can. That's the ideal situation. That's what I see a lot of. And then there's the other side is what I see a lot of, which is the inconsistent parent, may or may not be using drugs or alcohol, may or may not have other children, may or may not agree with you fostering their child. You just want to make the child aware, like I said, respect the parent's role, and kind of leave it open, leave it there, like leave it up to the child, how. But if they don't intersect with that parent, they're not talking about the parent, you won't see the parent, you're not going to see the parent. Respect that role and leave it where it is until maybe that baby come to you and say, hey, where's my birth mom? Or where, then you can explore that. But for the younger babies, and if it's a question mark, I say leave it where it is until, I'm not saying sweep it under the rug,
Yeah.
affirm it, talk about it. But if it's not something that they are pressing to meet, or the parent is not intersecting, they're not going to see it, carry on and keep loving that child and keep on in your process, and take care of that when you need to. But if it's a parent that's there, and try your best to integrate them. Try your best. That's the ideal situation. That's an amazing situation in my eyes,
Mm-hmm.
especially for parents who know what they are not capable of doing, especially for parents who are not going to come in and try to brainwash or try to intercede on anything you have going on. Try to intersect them as much as you can and with respect to them.
And I'm sure that with that, it's how do you say this when it comes to that including, I'm sure that then the foster or adoptive parent, is it a space where they need to set, I'm sure, boundaries, right? In terms of what that
Absolutely.
should
Absolutely.
look
What
like.
that looks like.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
And is that something that solely rests on that foster or adoptive parent?
I would say I would say, yeah, I would say depending. Okay. So if this is a foster child, and they have like a social worker in place or that is familiar with the history or whatever, then integrate them. If there's no other party involved and you're just the foster, you got the agency involved and that's about it, but there's no other party that you feel should have a say, you
Okay.
set the boundary. Yeah.
Okay.
Like now I typically wouldn't say let a birth parent set any boundary, to be honest. That's me
Mhm.
personally from a
Mhm.
therapeutic space. You set the boundary because you
Mhm.
are caring for the child.
Yes.
Um, but that's just my own personal / clinical opinion, is that If there is not a third party that is like legally responsible for this child in addition to you,
Mm-hmm.
then you set the boundary.
Okay. And then as children are getting older and they express themselves and or have different desires, does that weigh into it as well? And what I mean by that is,
Yeah.
and now I always say this, my degrees are in music, but I always am the person who feels let the children lead them.
Mhm.
And so is there the point that you think it's necessary or healthy to really bring the child in and have them to also help in this boundaries kind of thing? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that you're absolutely right in the fact that let the child lead, like, especially in this scenario, because intuitively, like we all have parents, right? We
Mhm,
might not have the greatest relationships with those parents. Intuitively, we want to know our parents. We want to, engage with our parents, and your child,
mhm,
some
mhm,
children are going to come to you and say, hey, ma, hey, dad, hey, mister, hey, miss, whatever they respond to, uncle, aunt, however they refer to you, address you. I want to meet my mom. I want to meet my dad. I want to know that side. You're going to have some children that ask that, right? And
mhm,
your child, you explore that with them. But I would say definitely let the child lead in that. But don't assume that the child is going to tell you either, right? I feel like as a parent, developmentally, children need to know where they come. You're going to start having these conversations about where children come from, developmental conversations. People have those at different times, right?
mhm.
Depending on where you are, like if you're having a developmental conversation with a 6-year-old, obviously, you're not going to talk about, you might not talk about where babies come from and all of that.
Right.
So I say include that, infuse that with development conversations. The same way you think about development, if you think your child is mature enough to know where a baby comes from and about love and start to learn about relationships, explore that with them,
Mhm,
as you
mhm.
see fit developmentally. I say that's the cutoff. I say about 11 or 12, start to introduce like that conversation.
Okay.
But intuitively, if a child is coming to you at 6, 7, because sometimes they do, 8, 9, 10, they want to know about their mom or their dad. You may have had a conversation with them. They may know about, I don't know where your child may be, but if they're asking intuitively, then infuse it as developmentally appropriate as possible, right?
Okay.
So I'm not saying if it's a 6-year-old and they're like, the 6-year-old might not necessarily know. They might not. The only way they might know is through a world lens, right? They might be in school, so they might, oh well, I don't have a mommy, or I don't have a. They might ask those questions, and with respect to where you are with your conversation with that child in development, explain it as such, include it as such, like and I don't feel like you, because it can get to be a very heavy conversation. It could be a
Yes.
light conversation. It just depends on where your child is and it depends on how old they are. But I don't want your 6-year-old coming in just asking, well, Johnny has a mom and a dad. Where's my dad? And then you're like, well, your dad, at 6, they don't need to know that their dad, is nowhere to be found, or they don't need to know those specifics. If
Mhm.
if you're a single adoptive parent and maybe they want to know about the other parent, whether same sex, opposite sex, infuse it as you see fit.
Mhm.
That's your child. You know what they will understand, so I'm not going to say at 6 you should be telling them. No, but around 12 or 13, when you start to have these conversations about babies and development and genetics, because in school they're going to start talking about it, right? You
Yeah.
don't want school to also keep a track of, you don't want school to infuse and get in their mind, and before you know they're coming home, asking questions before you were able to actually have that conversation. So
Mhm.
that's why I say when you start to see that development conversation happen, try to infuse it there. It's a little more easy to do that. But if children are asking intuitively, go with the grain, go with what you know about your child and explain it as it relates to their developmental space in that moment.
You bring up something very important, school. They spend 8 hours a day in that
Oh
in that
yeah.
place. What do you see as the school's responsibility? Now, this is to children in general and the way that we are now in terms of the vocabulary that
Mhm.
schools and teachers need to be very, very conscious about using or not using because we have so many different family structures now, right?
Yes, yes,
And we don't want to go with these heteronormative things anymore.
yes.
So what do you see as the responsibility and how really schools need to be and teachers need to be really, really speaking in terms of what vocabulary? How do you say, and
Right.
I know that could be kind of broad, that could be a lot,
No,
but
no, no.
maybe
No, no, no. No, no, no. I think that we as professionals have the responsibility to really be intentional with our tongue, right? Like we have
mhm,
to and where we are now, there's no excuse. Like myself, as a therapist, I apologize to any of my clients if I ever use the wrong pronouns. Like I am very, very aware of that, right?
mhm,
And in this time and in this space, there's no reason not to be aware of that,
mhm,
especially as teachers, right?
mhm, mhm,
Especially as instructors, and it is a struggle. We've always had like these workers, like the social workers, the therapists, the teachers. We have always been the community workers, the firefighters. The what police officers, the ones who are responsible for ensuring that the community as a whole, operates as such, and we're helping to bring the community up, right? So we're helping to bring the community up. We have to be aware of this language. Like
mhm,
you are teaching these students. So,
mhm.
if you don't know the language, how are you able to communicate with them?
Yeah.
We have to I think that schools have a responsibility. I think that so I don't think that it's too broad. I think that instructors, principals, teachers, especially because that's where children are learning, right? That's where they're
Yeah.
learning about similarities, that's where they're learning about differences. That's where they're learning about all of those things, right? And that's where it's upheld. That's where, like you said, they spend the most time. That's where all of that stuff is upheld. That's where, we see, because that's where most of their time is spent. Like we said, 8 hours a day,
Mhm,
is spent in school. So, you have to interact with these children as well. And they also are growing, changing, and want to be respected as such. They, them, he, she, and so if that's what they want to be respected as such, to know that you aren't integrating that into your own Rolodex, is a problem. And we as professionals, we have our own ongoing thing. Like life is an ongoing lesson, right? You should be forever trying to learn.
mhm,
We as
mhm,
professionals, especially us with licenses, have a responsibility to the community. That's why we have continuing education. We have to
mhm.
renew our licenses every 2 years. I would imagine it's similar for teachers and whoever
Yeah.
else, that carries a professional license. And within those spaces, there are CEUs, a plethora of them, discussing all of this, right?
Mhm,
We,
mhm.
you know, we we've done DEI down to the ground, so we need to start to really have these understandings and really start to put ourselves in spaces where we are being more of students and less of experts in the fact that we need to understand that times are changing and we need to get with them.
That's very profound. We need to we need to constantly be a student. It's never a time. And it is true. We have to be lifelong learners and you have to be open to that because things are always changing. This might catch you off guard a little bit in terms of this question, but it just popped into my mind after having taught. So if you had to create a professional development for for a school system dealing with this, what would you call it?
Ooh, ooh, that's a good one. Ooh, I might say something along the lines of "Meet me where I am" or something like that.
Mm.
Because we talk about a lot about meeting people where they are. Very rarely do we do it. So I would say something along those lines, like "Meet me where I am," something like that.
I like that. So keep it, develop that. You
That's a
know,
good idea.
I'm sitting here thinking because my wheels are always turning, and these things are so necessary because
They
the
are.
other piece of it is when we talk about the responsibility of a school and the teacher and how the and vocabulary that we're using, um, sometimes the tools aren't there. And
Mhm.
so I think about that even in terms of the sex ed kind of thing,
Mhm.
and having friends who are teachers who are, now in the state of Maryland, I don't think it goes so far. You know, we hear so many things politically, and they like
Right.
to make everything a big old boogie monster, and I don't think half of that
Mhm.
is based in reality. But
Right.
um for a friend, like one of mine teaches fifth grade, and I was like, "Would you be prepared to teach certain things?" And he was like, "No, I wouldn't. I don't know." You know, and so then we have the issue of, well, we want teachers to do a certain thing, but have not prepared them to do it. And so
Mm.
that's why I asked you that question,
It's
because I
true.
think that there needs to be more intentionality around how we are preparing the educators to educate. And some
Mhm.
of that I do believe can take down some of the misconception of all of that. Because
Yep.
when we don't know, then we have misconception, and then they turn into prejudices and all of this other
Yeah.
stuff because we don't know.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
but I like that I like the name of that. I think that, just me throwing out of there should probably be developed, and and
You
then
ain't
let's
lying.
see how.
I get, and that's so true. I think when we're in these spaces, like these urban spaces, we like, it's a little more flexible, we assume. But in spaces, like I spent time in Tulsa and Oklahoma, and they don't know anything. You're right. How
Don't
do
know
we
anything.
expect these educators to educate if they don't know?
Yeah, yeah, and they don't, and I do believe the
Yeah.
vast majority are trying their best, but there's so
Yeah.
much to keep up with, and sometimes it's just not there. But I don't want to miss the part that there is the responsibility to be able to still s- uh, be very sensitive and know how to be sensitive, because I always think about that with my son. And fortunately right now, see, our dynamic is very different in that he has my mom very present on a regular basis, so he
Oh.
does not really know or understand that
Mhm.
that there is no mom really
Mhm.
because eh, he because he's got mine, right? And
Right.
so
Right.
he doesn't know,
Conceptualize that part. Yeah.
not at all. So when children are at school and they're talking about mommies and daddies, he 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 doesn't think anything of it.
It's so funny you say that because that's why I created my book, because it wasn't until I was 11 that somebody just asked me, was my aunt my mom, that I realized, like, oh, y'all realize my life a little different. Yeah, they
So
looked me, is that your mom?
tell me about that. So is it where is your mom?
Is
Is
that
that
your
your
mama? Yeah,
mommy? Yes.
yeah,
Tell me
yeah.
about
That's
that. Dig into that a little bit more.
so it's like it's so funny how that kind of just because
Yeah.
he's Josiah 6, right?
Yes.
So yeah, so that makes sense. So developmentally, like, kids know mommy and daddies, but like if someone doesn't ask you directly, is that your mommy? You don't really realize, like, dang, I don't have a mom. Like, so it wasn't until I was 11, like my mom died when I was 11 years old. So
Mm.
I had always been up when people ask me, like kids just innocently ask, is that your mom? It always has been my mom. Or I could always just say, oh, it's my aunt. But my mother was still on earth. So I was at a cheerleading practice a little after my mom died, maybe like 6 months. And it was a new girl on the cheer squad, and my aunt brought me to practice, which she always did. All the girls knew my aunt brought me to practice. She always did, even when my mother was alive. But this particular day, was right after we had lost my mom, and this girl, she was just very inquisitive about everybody and who their parents were and everything like
Mhm.
that. So we sitting there, we chilling. My aunt drops me off. She's about to leave, and the girl just, she just real innocently asked me, like, "Is that your mom?" And,
Mhm.
like, just
Mhm.
looks me dead in my face, and my aunt looks at me like, "Uh-oh." And I'm just like, it didn't dawn on me, like, no, it's not, and no, I don't have a mom. So, like,
Ooh.
in that moment, it, like, really got me, and, like, I was on the verge of a breakdown, and I thank God my aunt was right there because she just kinda, like, played it off. She was like, "No, I'm her auntie. I bring her to
Mhm.
cheerleading practice," and, like, grabbed me. But, like, it sometimes you don't even realize until someone asks you, like, oh, wow, I guess you're right. Like my mom isn't here anymore. Like, and it was just so triggering. So when I got older, I was like, people always ask me about grief and people ask me, is it worse as a child? Is it worse as an adult? I just think grief in general is just horrific. I think
Mhm.
not living on earth without, someone that you've become accustomed to having is just horrific, right?
Yeah.
So I don't think there's a time period that is better or worse, but people always ask me, what was it like to lose your mom as a child? How did you navigate that? And as I started to like look for more and more resources for people whose children were losing their parents, a good girlfriend of mine, she lost her husband a couple of years ago with two young children. And they're looking for resources, for grief at that young of an age. How can you really explain it
Yeah.
outside of the fact that there is no longer a person present here,
Hmm.
right? So that's why I created Is That Your Mommy? Because it was kind of like it created, it created a space where children could understand that there is grief at every stage of life, and that sometimes you lose people sooner than others, right? And that you can still go on and live life, but and still remember that person. But like grief is this is what grief is, and this is what
Hmm.
grief will be. You carry it with you your whole life. The person is not here, and it's a very complex, it's such a complex, concept for us. So in the picture book, I'm like, hopefully, it creates some understanding where kids who do lose people, kids who haven't lost people, can really gain an understanding that, about death, about loss,
Hmm.
about because it's inevitable. And, we'd like to idealize it and say that, we could talk about it later, but, kids that lose their parents at 5 and 6, they feel that loss. I
Yes.
mean, the person is no longer here. You can't you and so my friend's child still, runs around the house asking, "Where's my dad? Where's my dad?" And so, this resource, has been really, really transformative because, she says she can kind of explain, like daddy was here, he's not here anymore, he's gone. There's other kids that lose their mommies and daddies, like it really helps. And so um life is life, and it can be really hard for children to navigate it.
Yeah, that's a heavy one. And because the part of it is now, as I was having this conversation earlier, children are dealing with so many different I mean, things that we just cannot imagine.
Fathom.
And and trying to even be conscious of all of this it can be a lot. But at the same time, those of us who are working with children, we kind of it is our responsibility, and that's why that that's that's very that book is very necessary. It's just so in so many different ways because again, children are experiencing loss, both mothers, fathers, and sometimes it's not even that they've lost them
It's
to
not even death.
death.
Right. It's not even death always.
Yeah. And trying to explain that and have that conversation is very challenging, and we don't have the words. And when you talk about death, our neighbor passed away, and Josiah, my son, is not one who gets connected to people very, very easily. And but when he really does really love you. And he was really connected to her. Actually, her
Mm.
funeral was yesterday, and I didn't say anything to him. She died on the 21st of January. I didn't say anything to him until today is Thursday. Um, Tuesday, the day of her viewing, because one, I didn't know how to have the conversation. I did not know what to say to him.
Mhm.
And I said, well, and I waited until Tuesday because I figured, well, I'll have this conversation and then give him the option if he
Mhm. To
wants
go.
to go see her for the last time to go see her. So it just all kind of go together. And and we take for granted how much children really are very, very smart. So while I still chose my words and I said to him, she's gone to see Jesus because we're Christians. And so this is how we talk. And I wouldn't project that on everybody else. And I said, but she's very happy. She feels very good because she's with her mommy and her grandmommy, and she missed them and they missed her. So she gets to be with them again. And and so he got it. But the thing that was so challenging because he got it so much until
Mm.
his first reaction was he just sat there and cried, which I was
Oh,
not really expecting.
expecting, right.
And so and then me as daddy trying to explain this and be all put together about it, because when you're trying to, say something or you don't want to have a
Mhm.
meltdown yourself, well then I had one because I was caught off guard. And it is sad. I mean, I've known it since I was a little boy. So it is
Mm.
very, very sad. And so But then what was so funny about this was, well, what was rather remarkable was, well, is her house gonna be abandoned? Like after he got, like he's beginning to think about all the other
Well,
scenarios
who's
now.
there? Yeah,
Right.
like
Nobody's there. And then and then because the way that Josiah's heart is through a toy, most particularly a vehicle of some sort, he said, and she always got me such nice trucks. And it's those things that's just like you almost want to chuckle at it. And I was like, yeah, I know she did get you such nice trucks. But all of that said, these kinds of conversations are not, they're not easy, and children are facing things in ways that honestly, when I was in school, I didn't. It's like life has changed. It
it
really
is. It is.
has.
It is. It's so different.
It's just not the same. I
It's not.
mean,
It's so different.
you didn't hear about. I don't recall anybody in my class who did not have a mommy or daddy like that they died. I don't recall
No.
any of that. I don't recall anybody in my class being raised by grandparents. I don't recall, but I'm also 44, so that really wasn't, it wasn't as prevalent. I mean, it happened, of course. That's happened since the
Yeah,
beginning of time, but it
but it
wasn't
wasn't as
as
yeah
prevalent.
as prevalent. Yep, that's so
And
true.
then, in terms of adoption, if it were the case, no one said it.
No
I
one
don't
talked about it.
really
Yep.
know if that
Yep.
if that were, if I had children in my class where this was where they were adopted, or even in the far, well, I did know of one because we grew up in the same neighborhood. And then he was here and then gone, unfortunately, just because of the nature of being in the foster care system. But it's these things that really have shifted and changed, and that's why I go back to that thing of, well, what do we do? How do we support teachers so that they're able to really speak more universally, I guess you would say, which is hard, so that we're
It is.
not
It is.
creating further trauma unintentionally.
Right. Right. It's not on purpose.
It's Let me ask, so going on a different side of things. So we dealt with the children who've been in the foster care system who actually may have potentially spent some time with with a birth parent. But so to a child like mine who spent no time, the time that
Mhm.
he came out of her womb and was held for whatever few minutes, um, but was in my arms at 2 weeks old.
Mhm.
What does that look? First of all, speak to this, because I think that people don't recognize that there's still a trauma, right?
Mhm.
And what would that trauma be?
Mm. So the trauma of a child that is detached from their mother at birth, or a trauma
Yeah.
of a child that knew their parent. Trauma detached at birth.
Detached at birth. Hmm.
Ooh, I mean, there is. I think that people think that that you have been carried in this person's body for 9 months.
Yeah.
You know, you have this person's blood pumping through your veins. So though you may not have known her voice, her smell, her touch post birth, you she felt your heartbeat, you felt hers. So like there are a lot of things that happen in utero that connection between mom and baby embryo, whatever you want to call it, is so close. Like literally with young baby girls, it goes so extensively that your mother is carrying your children. All the eggs you will have in your lifetime you are born with. So your mother is carrying your babies. Exactly. That's how extensive it is. So biologically, I think that we don't give these things enough credit. It's still abandonment. You still can feel it. It may not be something, that, when we have children that have known their mothers, we recognize that they might experience abandonment in the fact that they miss her touch, her smell, her scent, like having her there, but when you still have that connection to your mother.
Oh, you just took me to a whole nother space when you talked about the baby girls. Clearly, people will recognize that this is an audio only podcast, but uh, the level of stunned. But this is why these kinds of conversations are so necessary, right? This is what I want to help people
Mhm.
to understand the different layers here, because it's I think that people naturally think when a baby is placed in your arms as an infant and they don't have any memory, that it's not it's probably easier, it's probably okay.
Oh, it's
But the
yeah, exactly.
trauma, I it manifests itself in a different way. Like, I remember, and I fully believe this to be a part of that separation. He would cry a lot initially. And I and I feel like you think about infants in particular, that as soon as, so I can take an infant, a friend of mine, the infant's good with you for a little bit of time, and then it's like, I need my mommy smell.
I need
And they
my
cry.
mom. I need my
Yes,
mom.
I
Yes.
need
I need
her.
the feel of my mom. Yes.
Yes. And so then you give the baby back and the baby's automatically calmed.
Yep.
And I think about that with Josiah, in that there was a period. Now, there was a period he was constipated. That's a whole nother thing.
Baby.
But there was that early period where I just was like, he cried a lot, and then all I could think was, right, because
Mhm.
you're
Yep.
missing something, and you and right now at this juncture, it's so early on, daddy can't fix it. I can't,
Yep.
I can't, and so, like, you know, as we see, even when even in a heterosexual relationship, when women give birth, you see that the father also needs to take part in that skin to skin piece.
Skin to skin.
And
Mhm.
so I did that. Like, that was first night after he took his bath. Like, I had him on my chest for I don't even know how long. It probably was way too long, because I just was so happy to have my baby on my chest, But at the same
Mm.
time, I had to realize, though, you're trying to figure this out. Like, this isn't the smell, this isn't the you don't
Yep.
know
This is yeah,
this.
this is not the feel, the heartbeat. I don't recognize this.
Yeah. And so I wanted to bring that up just because I feel like that's important. But the eggs part, you really got me. uh,
Yes, I thank you for bringing that up because I think that people just think like the baby just forgets where they inhabited for 10 months, because it's not
yeah.
even 9 months where they were for 10. How do you forget? Did you went on if you were on a camping trip for 10 months, do you think you'd forget that experience? No, you
Hmm.
wouldn't.
Hmm.
Especially if it's what you needed to get to this earth.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so then when we and when we're moving on, when we're kind of still building on that. So again, we have the difference in the foster child that may have, because not all the time, have spent some period of time with their birth parent, have a memory of them, know who they are, know who siblings are, and all of this. When we then have a child like my child, who would have no memory whatsoever, and then you begin to have this kind of conversation with them. Like, fortunately, there are some, like you're talking about your children's book. Um, and we have these books centered around adoption, but still having that conversation and helping them
Mhm.
to navigate that. Because even with mine, he knows the word, but
Mhm.
all of the fine details of it, the understanding of it, that's not really
Mhm.
there right now. And I don't push anything, because, as you said earlier, I mean, I just, what he gives me is what I don't give him any more than what he asks. But in dealing with that, because this is another a word you use too when it came to foster care, but it does apply in this. There's still that overwhelming feeling of abandonment.
Mhm.
How do you navigate that? Because, you know, it wasn't necessarily. In some cases, it was, right? In some
Mhm.
cases, it literally was, but not in all cases.
Mhm.
And so, how do you navigate that when that's how it shows up, but that's not what it was? Does that make sense?
Mhm. Absolutely. So I think that it's important to have a conversations about how it shows up and how it was, right?
Mhm.
Because how it shows up is going to continue to show up. Like
Yeah.
as long as he is known to be adopted, it's going to show up as abandonment, regardless
Mm,
of at what point, right? Because he's not with his birth mother, right? And that goes for any child. Like, it's the same for me and my father. We're now great, we're good, but I still was abandoned by you from 0 to 11 because
mm,
you had your own personal issues.
mhm,
It doesn't show up the same anymore. It showed up a lot different as a child. It doesn't show up at all anymore. I don't think that it does, but it does. And so, like, it's a part of your story always, right? But it might not ever manifest, right? But it's still important to have the conversation about it, because you just never know how it could look in life, right? And so you just want to make sure that, especially with children who may have not, like you said, fresh out the womb, may have not experienced it, may not know. Um, Abandonment as a concept, is still, and it, like we said, it's the body keeps score is the best way to put it, right? Like, your body keeps score is the best way to put it. Like, it's so interesting. I read this book. It's called The Body Keeps Score, and it talks about the traumas that your body holds. And though, we may not consciously look at it as abandonment, he may not recognize it as abandonment. He may not ever know his mom out in the street, might not ever know if he ever had any siblings. He might not view it as that. But the fact still remains, he came out of a space that he no longer resides.
mhm.
That's just the fact. And abandon and it as an action, it may not ever come to fruition. But as a concept, it's still a part of his story, if that
Mhm.
makes sense.
No, it does. It definitely does. And I just feel like that's always a scarier part for us as parents, that, and trying to also, when we're dealing with that, trying to shield them from any pain that, comes along with that, because no matter what, and I hear, well, he's only known you, and and he loves you, so it's not, and it wouldn't it and I and yes, I know that to be true. However, when you realize fully, there's a whole nother part of you.
A whole part of your being.
Yeah.
The body
um
keeps score. It
yeah.
literally does. And so, I think if we start to understand from a scientific perspective, like, what our bodies are, right? I think that we think just like, okay, as humans in our thinking and what we know. But, like, our bodies, are very much so a part of us as well. And so, though he may not remember in terms of his mental, his body, his heart, he was carried in a vessel that he does not know.
Right.
So it's important to remember that, like, those spaces matter. It's just like an environment, just like children who have asthma. It's the same. The body carries that score. They may no longer be in a space that is full of dust and whatever, but they have asthma as a manifestation of the body being there, right? So it's the same. Your body
Mhm.
keeps score of those environments that you occupy. Asthma, eczema, all of that. We think about, mostly African Americans suffer from
Yeah.
the environments we were brought up in as children, as babies. It's the same. Abandonment. You are no longer in that environment.
Oh, wow.
I know. I know.
um I want to ask
It's
you,
whew.
it's there, and and this is the thing about these kinds of conversations. These are the kind of conversations that need to uh that need parts 2 and 3, because there's so many layers
3,
to
4, and
this.
5.
Right.
Right.
And I really, and really the main premise of this is to really kind of give some foundational understanding, and how, and how we can best support. I want to ask you this before I ask you about your other book. When do you think is a good time when uh for a child to enter into therapy when it comes to navigating navigating this? And I say that because I have been asking since the beginning of time, just because one, I have a therapist. I suffer from major depressive disorder, and so therapy is a necessary thing for me, and I happen to think for most everyone, because there's something there that someone needs to navigate.
Mhm.
Um, but in this case with him, he's 6. When do you think is a good time to really add that as a reinforced support for him?
I would 6, I wouldn't, you guys are in your bubble, things are great, like I wouldn't
Mm,
say unless, like he came to you and was like, "Where's my mommy tomorrow?" I
yes.
wouldn't advise at
Hmm.
6. I would advise as you start to want him to develop his ability to speak and express and really, hone in on language and really, putting emotions to things. And, when you start to get to that developmental stage where you feel like, you're talking to him about family and, and I'm pretty sure you're having
Hmm.
those entrance conversations right now, but maybe like around 10, 11, like when you start to get towards the double digits where he can actually comprehend and conceptualize, not
Okay.
just
Okay.
comprehend.
Okay. That makes
Because
okay.
because adoption is still a very difficult thing to conceptualize, if that makes sense. So you
Yes.
want to make sure that he can actually, pull it all together
Hmm.
and not
Hmm.
just feel like, oh, I'm adopted, because at 8 and 9, they know what adopted is, but it's just like this floaty concept. So I would say
Hmm.
when he's able to actually conceptualize what it means, the wholeness of it, I would say get him started, which is probably about, I would say 11 or 12, somewhere around that age.
Hmm. Yeah, the adolescent year. Yeah, they need a whole lot of
Double
support
those
then.
double digits. Once you start pre-adolescent, don't get them to like 13.
Oh
Get
yeah,
them like
yeah.
maybe like so you
Hmm.
can start getting his language and ability and desire to talk going, right? Because we also want him to want to be there.
True, true, true. Yeah. Okay, that's good to know because I've really been like, he needs to go, but that's because I'm over the top, and you just get nervous. You don't know.
I
Um,
mean, it's always a great tool, right? But at
yeah,
6, he's gonna be just driving them trucks around in circles, just on the floor.
yeah, and that's what he does. Yeah, that's all he cares about is his trucks. That's it. Um, I want to ask you. You have another book also entitled "We Need You Too." What is that book centering around? What are you discussing there?
Absolutely. So We Need You To is a book that it speaks to the positive affirmations surrounding Black men and Black role models in children's
Mm.
lives. The main character is based loosely off my brother. We grew up in a family that was heavily like male, it's now flip side, but like growing up a lot, my uncles had a lot of influence over my life. And um I had sat down with one of my uncles who had a big influence on my life. He said something along the lines of, as y'all got older and y'all dads, started to do better and come around, y'all no longer needed us, is what he said. So I was like, no, 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 no. We always need you. And so I thought it was a good idea because not only myself, I started to hear that a lot of my friends had, great uncles whose stories went untold. I feel like we always talk about the moms, the grannies, the aunties. And I feel like a lot of times the dads, the uncles, the male role models, the ones who taught you how to drive, tie your shoe, fix a flat tire. A lot of times they get left out of the conversation. They get left out of the credits as it relates to Black child
Mm.
healthy development. So I created We Need You To because I felt like um, Black men and Black role models deserve the space to be praised for, what they contribute to our child's development, our children's development as well.
That's beautiful. It's so necessary. So, so, so necessary.
Thank
Thank
you. I
you.
thought so too. I was like, "Woo,
Yeah.
y'all, we need to talk a little positive about the Black man."
Yeah. No, no, it's very true because I mean, we are present fathers too. I had a very present father growing up. And so,
Mhm,
um,
mhm,
I think that that needs to be discussed because there is that stigma, particularly around Black men, that they are non-existent fathers, and that is just
mhm.
not true.
No, not at all.
So I love that. Um, as we are wrapping, because we've covered a lot, and this has been absolutely amazing.
I've loved
Um,
it.
I, I'm just so grateful because you've given so much insight. What I want to um ask you as we are bringing this to a close, I always ask my guests to give us a little something, drop a nugget, a sprinkle of something, because so much of this is applicable to everyone. It's not just a one-sided situation in terms of just, an adopted child, a foster child, a this or that, but there's a broader kind of conversation here. What is the that you would want to drop on on everyone?
Absolutely. I would say I was, and with respect, especially to the topic at hand, adoption, I would say be open and go for it and keep going, because I feel like there's a lot of children in the system, especially children who look like us, that need us, right? That really need us. And I think that because we've come to know things in the system to be what it was historically, it's no longer that. There are a lot of changes. So I would say, be open, around what it means to be a parent, what it looks like to be a parent, what your conception of parenting is. Um, and if you're in this process, keep going. Keep
Hmm.
going, because it can get hard, and it can be daunting, and it can be very scary.
Yeah.
But it's worth it. It's worth it. And our children need it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very necessary. Thank you. As we are closing, I want to make sure that I reinforce that Sequoyah serves as the co-founder and COO of Solid Ground Wellness and
Yes.
also the CEO of On My Couch, both of which you can find those links. They will be in the description of this video, any social media, all of that, so that you can reach out to Sequoyah um, with some of your you might need a therapist. So many of us do. But
Yes.
man,
Yes.
come on
Yes.
in.
We all need a little
We need a little
therapist. Everybody needs
conversation.
a
A
therapist.
couch. Come to the couch.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I
Everybody need a
want
couch.
we definitely do. So I want to make sure that all of our guests will be able to find that in the description. And so again, I thank you so much for coming, for sharing all of this. It has been so hugely beneficial, and I think you
Absolutely.
developed a whole new professional development that's going to need to take place
Hello. You done
here.
gave me a whole new idea.
You
Thank you so
do.
much.
Oh,
It's been a
absolutely.
privilege. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And to our guests, I thank you for joining us today. I hope that you got something amazing out of this. I know that you did. Share it with a friend. And as it is my custom, I always end with adoption changes lives and brings worlds together. Thank you so much for joining. I will talk to you the same time, same place next Friday. Talk to you real soon. Bye.